Welcome back to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Alan Noble. Alan is an associate professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University, as well as the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Christ and Pop Culture. He has written for The Atlantic, Vox, BuzzFeed, Christianity Today, and many other places. And he's also the author of a number of books. Most recently, he's written a book entitled On Getting Out of Bed, The Burden and Gift of Living. Before that, he wrote a book on the Heidelberg Catechism Q&A number 1. What is your only comfort in life and in death? His book is the title, You Are Not Your Own, Belonging to God in an Inhuman World. And finally, his first book was entitled Disruptive Witness, Speaking Truth in a Distracted Age. In this conversation, we'll be talking a little bit about each of these books, as well as hearing about an upcoming book that will be released in the next year or so. So stay tuned for a fascinating conversation with Alan Noble. Alan, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate your willingness to come on. I know we have almost zero connection other than I follow you on Substack, and I sent you a message and you responded. So I'm so grateful that you made time for this.
Yeah, well, I love doing things like this, so this is a great fit.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I know that most of our listeners probably don't know your work very well or don't know you very well. And so why don't we start by just, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? And one of the ways I like to ask that question is kind of, what were the nouns that shaped you as a child, like the person, places, and things?
Yeah.
That kind of were instrumental in have been instrumental throughout your life.
Sure. So I would say I grew up in. I was first of all I was homeschooled. I like to say I was very homeschooled. I grew up and which means that I was homeschooled from kindergarten all the way through high school, and we had goats. That's the definition of being very homeschooled. You have to have goats, and in Southern California. So it was a kind of with a group of other homeschoolers who were sort of ex-hippies. So they were very interesting, eclectic, anti-authoritarian, homeschoolers, very crunchy type people. It was a great group, great childhood, and I had a great experience. And they introduced me to one of my nouns, which would be Francis Schaeffer, who was the first one who introduced me to the idea that you could be a Christian and take culture seriously. Prior to that, my church experience was growing up in Pentecostal or charismatic churches. So I went to Assemblies of God, and we went to some non-denominational churches, and they tended to be very fundamentalist in their flavor. And at that time in the desert of Southern California. And so the attitude that I was presented with toward culture was culture is a scary thing. So for example, I remember going to a record burning party. So we burned records and T-shirts of 80s hair bands, and this is the attitude we have towards culture. Culture is a scary thing; it's a dangerous thing. We've got to get rid of it and run away from it. And Schaeffer blew my mind because I took this class taught by other homeschool moms, and they were advocating for this guy named Francis Schaeffer. And here he was, this weird guy who took culture seriously, who actually listened to secular music, watched secular movies, and read secular novels, and said, there's something valuable here to be learned, to be understood, to be enjoyed, to be dialogued with. And that really appealed to me because there was something in me that loved culture and
Mm.
wanted that and just wanted to have some model for what that looked like. And I had no previous model for that. It was all retreat from culture. So that Schaefer was a big influence on me. I know intellectually there's some flaws in his, for example, understanding of Kierkegaard and some other things, but
We won't judge him for that.
we're not going to judge him for that. Yeah, he for me and for many others, he was a turning point. He really, as a teenager, he changed the trajectory of my life. Reading
Wow.
him, and so at that point, I decided I want to sort of my calling is to help the church understand culture better. And as I developed as a young man, I grew in love for literature. And so literature is the particular way that I focus that. That's the area of study that I've gotten into. So I have a
Mhm.
PhD in literature from Baylor University. So that's my specialty, but my passion is much broader than literature, as my books show. I'm concerned with that big question of how does the church participate in culture in a way that glorifies God and edifies our neighbor.
Mm. Yeah, that comes out really clearly in your books. I mean, I was actually as I've been reading your books, I've kind of thought, wow, this isn't your average English professor. I mean, you really are like you know, a full-on theologian who's critiquing the culture and analyzing the culture and bringing the gospel to bear on the culture. And so your books have been just some of the most recent books that have been kind of most inspiring for like really good theology that's like deep, like on ground level. Like you're not like it's not esoteric in any way. It's like bringing the great truths of scripture and theology to bear on really specific issues. And I've really found that helpful as a reader because I think a lot of theologians they're good at writing theology, but not always bridging the gap. And I feel like you're doing a lot of bridging of the gap. Is that an accurate assessment?
So I feel like my calling as a writer is to take the great works of scholars who are inaccessible or um, like inaccessible or a lot of work for
Mm,
most readers and make them accessible and apply them in ways that the scholars themselves never applied.
mm,
So, for example, in my first book, Disruptive Witness, which is all about secularization and technology of distraction, I took Charles Taylor, who's a wonderful Canadian philosopher and a brilliant theologian and philosopher. But his book, A Secular Age, is 800 pages of thick philosophy that I'm not going to ask the local pastor to read. That's not a reasonable request. And Jamie Smith from Calvin has done a great job in his "How Not to Be Secular" of sort of summarizing that. And in my book, I take some of those ideas from Taylor and apply them specifically to the challenge of bearing witness to the gospel
mm,
and in an age of distraction, and how those two things work together to make it difficult for us to share the gospel when people are distracted and when people have a hard time believing in the idea of a transcendent God. It's difficult for us to share the gospel.
mm,
And in my second book, I took the work of Jacques Ellul, this French sociologist, and again, his book, The Technological Society, is brilliant, but it's really thick and it's dense, and it's just not a reasonable thing to ask someone to wade through that.
mm,
And I feel like what sort of the gift that I have, if I have a gift, is being able to take these more scholarly works and bring them down to a level that and apply them in ways that the original authors never applied them, so
mhm,
that to our current predicament, like you said, to like concrete things, like what's going on today,
Mhm.
what's happening today that's pressing. So Jacques Ellul talks a lot about technique and efficiency. Well, he never talked about stay-at-home moms and the way that stay-at-home moms have pressures to live highly efficient lives in the way that they raise their kids. Well, I talk about that in You Are Not Your Own, and that's the way I apply things. So I'm glad you picked up on that, but that is sort of how I feel like I have an angle of
Yeah.
approaching things.
Yeah, and I'd even add, when as I've been reading yours, your books are all very, to me, I've read the full of On Getting Out of Bed. I read the entire thing. And I've read large portions of You Are Not Your Own, and I've kind of skimmed more of Disruptive Witness, just because I haven't had the time. But I feel like there's a lot of themes that are overlapping in those books. It seems like there's a
Yes.
frame, you're building a framework, but at the same time, I think um, like each book is very specific to a very specific matter, and you write quite differently in the books. At least like On Getting Out of Bed is a very different feel of a read compared to You Are Not Your Own. Like you're using a lot of second person pronouns, and and it's really, to me, On Getting Out of Bed feels like almost like a manifesto of like, it's like a charge to people with mental health issues, me being one of those. Like it's like a charge of like, um life is worth living because you're God's good gift. Like
Yeah.
um and whereas You Are Not Your Own felt more like deep analysis,
Yeah.
and application, but less like first person experience.
Yeah.
And so I think, I guess one thing I've admired in my short time of reading you is just um, your ability to write in a variety of ways and take these big topics and bring them down, but you're writing in really creative and thoughtful ways, that your books are just like, they're not stale. Like you're just like reading. I just found them so engaging.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you for that good work. Um, Going back a little bit to your story of getting a PhD in literature,
Yeah.
what was it? What was the PhD on, like, in particular?
Yeah, so I studied. My dissertation was on manifestations of transcendence in 20th century American literature. So it
Mm,
was about secularization and about challenges to secularization. So I used Charles Taylor, and that
mhm.
was and that's why Disruptive Witness sort of came about. Was I was already immersed in that conversation and in that scholarship, and just carried it over and applied it in a radically different way to to the church, really.
Yeah,
um, but you see ideas from that dissertation, I think, come up in Disruptive Witness, and near the end, as I talk about the way literature can challenge us and break through the secular frame that we're living in. So it shows up. It shows up. But
yeah.
that was my
What
dissertation.
what were some of the works within 20th century literature that you focused on?
Yeah, so I focused on Fitzgerald,
Mhm.
and so The Great Gatsby was one of them. I focused on J.D. Salinger, so I focused on Franny and Zooey and some of his short stories. I focused on Carson McCullers, and I focused on Cormac McCarthy, so I focused on Blood Meridian and The Road, and I think that was it
Oh
for
yeah,
McCarthy.
is it in You Are Not Your Own? The road comes up a lot,
I don't know if it's in.
or is
I,
it?
It's on Getting Out of Bed, I
Oh
think.
yeah, okay, yeah,
Yeah,
that came up a lot, and I've not read that book,
yeah,
so I
you should.
definitely got to put that on my list.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What's a high level summary of that book?
Yeah, so it's a post-apocalyptic book. It's a story about a father and a son traveling in a world that has been society has been wiped out. We don't know the cause of it. We don't know if it's a nuclear apocalypse or some natural disaster, but all vestiges of civilization have been destroyed, and there are roaming bands of cannibals. And it's a father and son journeying south to try to find um, some shelter from cold cold, and try to find food and maybe some good guys, some, as they call them in the book. And they're just trying to survive. And the question at the heart of the book is, why keep journeying if there's not any indication that society or civilization is going to revive itself? And all indications in the novel is that society or civilization, humanity is dead. It's not coming back from this. The people are just going to die out. And so there arises the question, well, then why keep going? Why keep going? And that is the question at the heart of On Getting Out of Bed. Why keep going? Which I think I argue is a fundamental question that every human has to ask at one time or another. And I try to offer some meaningful gospel-based answers to in that book.
It reminds me of the movie series The Quiet Place.
Yeah,
And for those who are listening and haven't seen The Quiet Place, it's a similar kind of post-apocalyptic, but it's because these monsters are killing people, and they can hear, they're attracted to sound, and so people have to remain silent so that they don't get caught by the monsters. And in that series as well, it's like very few people are left. And it does feel like, I think I remember feeling that way while I was watching those movies. Like, how could you, how could you um, continue on? Like, why would life be worth living? And um, and so I think that is such a valid question, because today, I mean, I'm assuming you've connected it at times to the messages we get about climate change can feel
right.
that way. Like,
Yeah,
well, it's, I feel like the constant message is the governments need of the world need to come together and find a solution, and they fail to do that year after year. And so we're
right,
getting to the point of no return. And it can feel a little bit definitely apocalyptic in the sense of like, well, there's no hope for our great grandchildren at this point anyways.
right.
So why have children? Why continue the species, so to speak? Um, we're Yeah. So what have been some of the responses you've gotten to that book on getting out of bed? And I might add, maybe you can answer this first. Is what motivated you to write that book in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this book came out of a lot of personal experience. I have OCD, and so there was a lot of personal experience that inspired it. And then there was also so there are sort of three things, and then there was also I had seen it actually came out of an article that I wrote. Called On Living, and the article, which was in response to just hearing about um, a pastor who had been an advocate for mental health and who had tragically taken his own life. And I thought about, and made me think, not in a judgmental way, but just in a practical, real world effects. Like, what is that going to have? What effect is that going to have on this person's congregation?
Mm,
Um, and what is that going to communicate to the people who suffer from mental illness, who he's been a source of encouragement to, right?
mhm,
And not trying to judge that person, because I know I can't put myself in that person's shoes, and so I don't know. And so trying to keep that balance, but still recognizing our actions have real world effects. And it just struck me that at that moment that um, our lives are a witness when we choose to, and this is part of the argument of the book, when we choose to get out of bed and keep going despite suffering, that is a witness. That is a witness. That's the positive side. That's the positive side. When we choose to keep going, that's a witness to people that life is worth living. And that's an encouraging thing. Because when you're in a period of despair, one of the things that can happen is you feel like there's nothing I can do that's meaningful. I'm a waste. I'm a drain. And what I want to come around and say is actually just getting out of bed and going through the motions, which you think is meaningless, is a great testimony to those around you. It
Mm.
says this life is grand and worth living. It's worth fighting for. So you're doing something miraculous. You're doing something good. Um, so that kind of inspired me. It caused me to think a lot about what is it that we're testifying to? Like whether we like it or not, our lives are a testimony to something. And so how are we going to shepherd that testimony? And then the third thing is, I work with a lot of college students, and nationally, um, it's well documented that we have, a mental health crisis basically in higher education. A lot of students, and this goes down to high school, young people are not doing well. And so I meet with a lot of students who and send a lot of students to our counseling services. And so that was really on my heart a lot. Just spending a lot of time with students and giving them a lot of counsel and encouragement, as well as recommending them and sending them to the counseling services. But just recognizing how much hurt there was and how much need there was for what I would call wise counsel. And I make this case in the book that while there's a valuable, a critical, in fact, we need to invest in it more, a critical space for therapy and for psychiatry. Um, we also need to have space for wise counselors, people who aren't perhaps trained professionals, but who are friends who are willing to just sit and listen,
Mm.
to give hugs, to be a shoulder to cry on, to give encouragement to, I've had friends who, and I talk about this in the book, who, when I'm dealing with anxiety, who I've just been able to call on the phone and just talk to just for 5 minutes. And it's been able to help me get through the day. Um, those kinds of wise counselors and friends and pastors, I think are critical. I have a concern that too often we commercialize um, counsel,
Mm.
whereas for as long as humanity has existed, we have turned to each other for help, to talk to each other, to pray together, comfort each other. And recently, I feel like we've stopped talking to each other and felt like, well, I don't want to share my burdens with you. That's for a therapist.
Mm.
And I think we lose something great there. And so part of the mission of this book is to kind of simulate that wise counsel, to be that voice of a good friend. I sort of tried to envision myself as a loving friend writing a letter to somebody, giving them encouragement, and that's the kind of voice I wanted to have. Um,
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think that's a really good point. Like, you know, it kind of makes me ask the question, has the pendulum swung too far? Because like 20 years ago, going to therapy felt like something you would not tell anyone.
yes,
And then
100%.
now, I'm in my uh, early to mid 30s. And my friends and I, like my generation, we're all in therapy. We've all gone to therapy. We all
Yeah,
talk about it.
yeah,
It's very, at least in my circles, It's very like there's no shame about going to therapy, but by emphasizing the importance and the benefit of therapy, has it affected the way we see our roles as friends, as siblings, as spouses? I think that's a really good question.
It's I think it's a critical one because we can professionalize, what is the word I would use? Professionalize
Mhm.
basic human comfort and encouragement, and frankly, and as I talk about in the book, your session comes to an end, and what happens when you need that comfort, right? When you have a friend, there's somebody there who can be with you. When you have a spouse who you have a relationship where you talk about your struggles, you have somebody who can be there with you. We need to build these relationships where we're talking about our struggles and we're sharing burdens with each other outside of the therapy room, so that there can be this kind of carrying each other's burdens and encouraging each other and strengthening each other. And so I think that's really valuable. And it also helps with, I think the loneliness epidemic, because, this therapy can be a way we isolate from one another. We try to hold all our problems in on ourselves and then just offload them onto a therapist rather
Mhm.
than sharing them with a community and helping them, seeking help from a therapist, right? So
Yeah.
I want to
Yeah.
say, I don't want to say it's either or, I want to say both and,
Mhm.
right? Because I think we actually need more investment in mental health services. I think we're actually underfunding mental health services, but
Mm.
at the same time, I think you're exactly right. The pendulum has swung too far, and what we've done is, what's very natural to us in a consumer society, we've professionalized something, we've turned it into a consumer product. And what we need to do is sort of reclaim that communal approach to life, really,
Mhm.
because the reason in the book I talk about mental affliction instead of mental health, or mental illness or disorders a lot, is because I want to say that a lot of this is just, it's bigger than a specific diagnosis. It's just, this is life. We're all going through this. We're
Mm.
all going through this, one
Yeah.
thing or another.
Yeah. Would you what do you think about, um, the difference between maybe 100 years ago or, I grew up in a small town, like, where people lived in smaller communities, less of these big urban centers, and they were multi-generational in that community. They were known because you couldn't get away from, the 1,000 other people who lived in your community. Um, like, I think about, like, that kind of setting, and it's a setting that I grew up in, where everyone knew each other and kinda knew what was going on with each other. And, there was a real deep sense of security and support in that kind of setting, at least in my experience in the larger community. But in my adult years, I've lived in cities mostly, big cities, and, you feel I've felt isolated at times. I found making friends quite difficult. And over the years, I've had to really learn how to be very intentional with finding good friends that I can rely on and actually relying on them, like calling them up and being like, "Hey, can we chat?" Or
Hmm.
texting and be like, "Can we chat in an hour?" I did that last night with a friend. And um, do you see that as like kind of a thing that affects us today? That it's just like it's harder to make friends. I think especially for adults.
It's definitely, I think it's definitely harder to make friends than, and there are a myriad of historical and sociological reasons for this. Um, One, you can take the decline of clubs, for example, right? So it used to be just 50 years ago, you would have Elks clubs and
Mm,
wolf lodges and bowling clubs and all sorts of clubs like this, and you would be a part of them, and these voluntary associations that would bind you to people and you would be a part of, and that's how you could make friends outside of the workplace,
mhm,
and which is valuable to do. But for most of us today, once you leave college, you lose the opportunities to find people, to find friends outside of your workplace. You've got
mm,
your spouse, and then that's it. And we rarely know our neighbors. We live in hyper autonomous society, where, as I mentioned earlier, with the mental health thing, we try not to uh, we try to bear our own burdens. And I get into this with "You Are Not Your Own." The ideal for the modern person is that you stand alone as a self-sustaining person.
mhm,
And you see that in the modern city, but you'll see that in small towns as well today.
mm,
The person who tries to bear their own burdens, to be themselves, to be their own individual. The problem with that is that kind of person doesn't make a good friend. Friendship, by its nature, um, relies on dependence, relies on the sharing of loves, relies on the sharing of times, the giving, the sacrifice of time and attention, and where our society is not set up for that. We also have the problem of, which I also talk about in "You Are Not Your Own," of technique. Um, we are driven so much by efficiency, which is technique is just the maximization of efficiency in every sphere of human life. That's what Jacques Ellul says. So we try to be efficient in every single inch of our lives. Everything we
mhm.
try to do it efficiently. So when we do that, friends aren't efficient. If you think about it, friends aren't efficient. So when you called your friend up and said, "Hey, can we chat for an hour?" That wasn't an efficient use of time, right?
No.
That was beautifully inefficient. Um,
You
uh,
might say we wasted our time together.
you did,
Yeah.
and what's even more ideal is calling up a friend and saying, "Hey, let's spend Sunday afternoon together. Come on over. I have no agenda."
Mm,
And you just come over and you just spend time together. You
mhm,
don't you're not trying to accomplish something. You're not trying to network. You're not trying to um, uh, get to know them better in some particular way for some particular reason. You're just being with someone. That's what friendship involves, um, and you have to do that over time. But our efficient society says you should feel bad for doing that. You should
mm.
feel guilty because you're wasting time. You should be doing some other things. You should be, cleaning or organizing or catching up on this work that you have to do. So society gives us all these different kinds of pressures that push us away from each other. They encourage us to be autonomous, to not rely on friends. They encourage us to be hyper competitive, so we want to compete against each other, which is works against friendship. They encourage us to be highly efficient, so we don't want to make time for friends. Um, Also, another thing, C.S. Lewis in his book Four Loves argues that friendship is standing side by side and looking at the same thing and loving it.
I love that.
And yeah, it's a great image of love. But I talk about this in my next book, which is tentatively titled "Recollecting Your Life," and it's
Mm.
about the virtues. And I talk about friendship in it. And the challenge there is that you actually have to love something good. And I worry that one difficulty in our society is that we often love really shallow things. So
Mm.
what is it that we're bonding over is another way of putting it.
Mhm.
If you and I only love really shallow things, it's hard for us to build a friendship over something that's vapid. So if you and I love Survivor, that that love is not going to build a deep friendship. If
No.
you and I both love the church, that love could be something.
Mhm.
Um, and our society produces a lot of vapid things. And so one of my concerns is that we often don't cultivate loves that are meaningful and rich, that could turn into things that create good friendships, and instead we pursue empty, trivial, meaningless um loves, and we end up alone.
I think, another way to say that might be, if you're bonding over what's trending, you're not gonna have a deep friendship.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I think it immediately reminds me of in COVID when Tiger King came out.
yeah,
That was one of those things, it's like everyone saw Tiger King and everyone was like, just appalled by it and in shock by it and thought it was also hilarious. Like, but those aren't that Tiger King is not what's gonna keep people together when that person all of a sudden feels like life's not worth living anymore.
right.
Um, yeah. So all of this has, kind of made me think about the question: our inability to build good friendships, deep friendships, our inability to waste time with other people. Um, how does that affect our relationship with God?
Well, that's a great question. Um, if we are not so I think there's a couple of ways of answering this. First of all, if we are not giving our attention to other people, we are failing to love our neighbor,
Mm.
and therefore we are sinning against God and our neighbor. So that's one way it affects um, our relationship with God. I think all of us need to start thinking about our attention as one of the most valuable resources that we have, because our
Mm.
attention is, to the world, the most valuable commodity of out there. Everybody is vying for our attention. Everyone wants us to pay attention to it, to them, to look at them, to click, to view, to scroll, to touch. Our attention is valuable. And so when we turn our gaze towards our neighbor, or when we turn our gaze towards God, we're sacrificing our time, we're giving our time to something or to someone that is and we're saying by that gaze that they are valuable, that they matter.
Mm.
My my suspicion is if you are not taking the time to sacrifice your gaze to another human being, you're probably also not doing it with God. You're
Mhm.
probably also not taking the time to do devotion and prayer and really, really open open prayer to God. And what I mean by that is I can imagine someone who has scheduled in their calendar devotional time, and they religiously do it every morning, but it's performative. It's functional. It's what they have to do to get on to the next thing of their day to be productive. And they know they have to do it to be a good Christian, so they do it and they just go through the motions and they get through it and they move on. But there's a kind of openness to God and a kind of wonder and a kind of inefficient worship of God that would be or an inefficient where you allow, for example, the reading of scripture, you allow your mind to wander, you allow it to explore what you're reading. And in prayer, you allow your mind to explore, who you need to pray for and what you need to be thankful for. Those seem like two radically different approaches to worshiping God and our relationship to God.
Mhm.
And so one comes from a heart driven by efficiency and by trying to achieve and to justify oneself, and one comes from a heart that recognizes that we already have our justification in Christ, and we can rest in that and just receive
Mm.
and bask in the wonder of God, and that's a great relief.
Yeah, I mean, that's really profound. I mean, it not only this idea that you resting in God because you belong to him, you're justified by him. It not only I often think of that as like and I'll say it to my congregants in a sermon or something. I'll say something like, because you belong to God, um you don't have to be stressed out about getting these 12 things done tomorrow and feel like a failure if you don't get them done. Because even if you don't get your schedule done, your list done, you still belong to God. And
Right.
so that's kind of like a preventative thing. But you're making me think of it as like you belong to God, and because of that, look all the things you get to do. Like you can go
Right.
and waste an afternoon with a friend and not accomplish anything and know that God is delighting in that.
Yeah.
Um, and and another kind of similar to that is like you could go and waste an afternoon walking a trail in and just praying to God, and you could spend the whole afternoon with God. Um, and sure, that's not efficient. You're going to have nothing to show for it by the end of it, but you're delighting in God. God's delighting in you, and that's the freedom that Christ gives us.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And part of what we're talking about is the distinction between storing up treasure on earth and storing up treasure in heaven.
Mm.
Because the reality is, these wasteful things are meaningful and are valuable and are good
Yeah.
and are, I would say, storing up treasure in heaven. That wasteful afternoon with the friend, the walk on the trail is storing up treasure in heaven. But
Mm.
it's it's just not measurable. And in our society, we are just so it's just so drilled in our head that if it's not measurable here and now, then it doesn't matter. Then it's just not real. Now I don't want, somebody to start calculating their treasure in heaven or anything, but I do think it I'll want us to recognize it is a good thing that you're doing when you're being wasteful in these ways. It's not waste for waste's sake.
Mhm.
It's toward the good, but it's just that you can't measure that good in the here and now, and that's
Mhm.
okay. And
That's okay.
that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, amen to that. I think, wow, to be free from having to measure every last thing. It's actually one of so I work out at this local gym, and they have this little band that you can wear that like will track your heartbeat and your calories and everything like that. Kind of like an Apple Watch, but it's specific to this gym. And I have refused to get it because I'm like, who cares if I know how many calories I burn in this workout? I'm just here to work out. and it doesn't actually make any difference whether I
Yeah.
know how many I burn or I don't know how many. If
Yeah.
I the goal here is just to stay healthy, so I'm going to keep coming back, and I don't need to worry about the measurements here.
Yeah.
But I think it's so drilled into us from like our Apple watches to our phones to everything. We are constantly having to measure our success. And one of the ways I've seen that um, feel like a big disconnect in my life and in other people I know who are also pastors or missionaries is when when a pastor or a missionary has to provide a report of their work
Oh, yeah.
to their leadership or to a governing body of some kind. There's always this disconnect. Be like, oh well, how do I report on my work? Um, how do I measure that I've been ministering to people, that I've been, I mean, I
Yeah.
can say, oh, on this day I spent 2 hours with this person and we talked about X, Y, and Z. I mean, you could do that, uh, but it gets really like weird because you're talking in such relational categories that it's so hard to measure.
Yeah.
And then so uh, one way for me in my work, because I think, as a pastor, you should report to your leadership and, and be accountable. But I've kind of learned over time that I can do that without measuring the success or failure of it. I can just tell a story. And my
Mm.
reports, especially lately, have been more like a story of like, what's been going on this month? Well, let me tell you a story of how I think God's been at work this month. Um,
Yeah.
and it's a different approach, but I think it comes back to this idea that um, rel trying to measure relational realities is will always feel odd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah. There's a drive that we have to make everything measurable. And
Mhm.
even the immeasurable, we want to make measurable. And I think it's valuable to push back against that. And maybe by telling stories, that's a respectful way to push back, and
Mhm.
a reasonable way to, because to some extent, we need accountability, and it's just offering reasonable accountability without trying to force measurements on things that can't be measured. We're constantly running into that with higher education.
Mm.
You know, uh, I work at Oklahoma Baptist University, and part of our mission is to integrate faith with learning. But it's challenging trying to measure how much are you integrating faith into your classroom, right?
Right.
Like, how many verses you used in a class, or like, how many conversions you get at the end of a semester, or what does it look like?
You have those Billy Graham cards. It's like, I made a decision for Christ. You've
Right.
got like 12 of those.
It's hard, and so we've tried to come up with some metrics to try to do it, because we have to report to governing bodies too, like official
Yes,
government governing bodies, in order to get funding, and for the students, and
of
and
course.
and to be legitimate and all these things, and so, or accredited, and so, but yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult. You do what you have to do to stay alive, but it's difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like um, there's some things you just got to do because of X, Y, and Z requires it. But I think as Christians living today, we should always be thinking of how can I be subversive in this? Like,
Yeah.
how can I? Because I don't believe that these things can be measured, and I don't think they need to be. So how am I can be a little subversive to show that there's something else here? Like, there's more going on here than just measuring how much faith is in the classroom or how much ministry has happened. There's God's at work in much bigger ways than those.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Well, I see that's about our time. I think that's a great place to end. Alan, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Yeah.
I feel like I could just talk to you for the next 3 hours because this has just been so fun.
Yeah. This has been great.
Yeah, so I'll have to have you back, and I look forward to seeing that book on the virtues come out eventually. And I know the publishing process can take its sweet time, so
Yeah.
but I'll keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, I'll be suggesting some of your books to my congregants and to friends because you're doing such a good work for the church. So really
Thanks.
appreciate you. Yeah.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. If you want to hear more of these conversations, be sure to like and subscribe, whether on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. We need you to spread the word about the Faith Informing Podcast. Thanks so much, and until next time, take good care.